Hello, everyone, and happy Earth Day. We're excited to talk to a group of experts in the sustainable business space today, really about some very important issues that face our planet and are actually reshaping business and the business climate today. We have pulled together a panel of experts here. I'll let them introduce themselves in a second, but certainly a lot of things have started to change at the earlier part of this year. The SEC announced its proposal for climate disclosures for US public companies. The new rules would really require businesses to report their greenhouse gas emissions, along with details of how climate change is affecting their businesses, as well as many, many other things. And so we'll go through that specific change in more detail because it, in fact, actually, I'd say at the very least sets a tenor of where things are going, perhaps in a much greater sense is actually helping to reshape and outline where things are going to be evolving in the near future. But if we go through the group, we've got an amazing group of folks here today. We have Alf Poor, he is the CEO of Ideanomics, Andy Behar, who is the CEO of As You Sow, Evan Vahouny, who is the Chief Impact Officer at Proof of Impact, and Aruna Inalsingh, who is the marketing lead at Justly. And we'll go through each one of these businesses, but Alf, why don't we start with you and tell us a little bit about your role at Ideanomics and what you guys are up to.
Yeah, thank you, Brent, and thank you to the fellow panelists today, and happy Earth Day, everybody. My name is Alfred Poor. I'm the CEO of Ideanomics. We're a company headquartered in New York and listed on the NASDAQ. We have two business divisions, Ideanomics Mobility. Mobility focuses on electric vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells, and associated energy storage and charging systems. The second division we have is Ideanomics Capital, which is focused on the financial services side of things. And one of our group companies is joining us today, which is Justly.
Great. Andy, what are you up to at As You Sow?
Well, thank you. And also happy Earth Day to everyone. As You Sow has been around for 30 years. We're a 501c3 nonprofit focused on corporate accountability. We engage the largest corporations in the world, and we talk to them about issues. Climate is probably the biggest issue, but also environmental health, human rights, racial justice, and other ESG issues. We basically engage the companies, we talk to them, and if necessary, we escalate by filing shareholder resolutions. We're probably best known for being the #1 filer of shareholder resolutions and then engaging the companies beyond that.
Great. The voice of the shareholder. And Aruna, tell me what you're up to at Justly.
Thank you, Bant. This has been a real treat to be here with other panelists and to talk about things so important on Earth Day. Justly itself is a broker-dealer. We're registered with FINRA, and we also have a crowdfunding platform with companies that are ESG principled. So they're involved in environment, social transparency, and also corporate governance. And so we are trying to help others get access to private equity in companies that are doing the right thing.
That's great. And Evan, Proof of Impact, what are you guys up to?
Yeah, so Proof of Impact, we are a data intelligence platform. We enable the real-time collection, verification, and analysis of ESG and impact data. And our goal really is to engage and empower investors and companies to take advantage of their data, leverage it, and actually pair it with performance-based financing so that we can encourage action and really change the trajectory of the status quo from where we're headed now.
That's great. Well, we really have quite a few dimensions that we're going to be covering here with all of the folks on the panel, from obviously what Alf and the Ideanomics leadership team are up to really all the data work that Evan and his team are up to. But Alf, let's jump back to you and talk about Ideanomics. You guys are very active in the clean tech space. Electric tractors, electric motorcycles, electric bikes. I mean, I know you and I have spoken about some of these things. What is your perspective right now on the latest ruling from the SEC and really where you see the landscape right now in general?
Thanks, Ben. I think the move by the SEC is a very important one. At a board level and management level, Ideanomics see it as something very similar to the NASDAQ ruling last year for diversity. Whether it's diversity or it's ecological impact, we're facing a societal change. And so the folks that really want to welcome these types of changes, I think, are going to be very impactful. Ideanomics wants to be at the forefront of this. We supported the NASDAQ in front of the SEC with the diversification program last year to bring in more female management, female and diverse board leaders, LGBTQ and folks of other ethnicities as well as females. And we see this as another step and a very important step as well. And it's really broken down for Ideanomics perspective into 3 buckets. And you touched a little bit on this earlier, Bant. It's, what is our footprint? How much energy are we using? What types of raw materials are we using? Okay, and we need to be able to disclose that for shareholders, institutional and retail alike. Then there's the second one. Who are our upstream suppliers? This is probably the trickiest part of it. Okay, making sure that you know who you're acquiring raw materials and supplies from are also ESG compliant, or you have to disclose if they're not. And then the third part is really the impact that we're seeing today on the planet, okay, which is what operations do you have that may be impacted by climate change? Mm-hmm. Are you operating in an area with tornadoes or hurricane activity? Are you in an area that's prone to wildfires? Are you in coastal areas that are prone to rising sea levels? And so all of these things need to be disclosed appropriately and adequately so shareholders can take decisions about the types of companies they want to invest in. So we take it very seriously. We've already started the groundwork. We've worked with Sustainalytics to get an initial ESG rating, but this isn't something that you don't do one day and you do the next. Right. It's complicated. You have to step into it. It's going to change the way that you run your business and some of the decisions you make from your suppliers through to the end product that you provide and the locations often that you'll put your operation. So it's a very holistic view you need to take. But by and large, we welcome the SEC's movement on this because there's only one place that all of the species on this planet that we're aware of currently live, and that's called planet Earth. And if we don't take some action to look after it, our home won't be here in the future.
That's a great way of phrasing it, Alf. And Andy, I just be curious. I mean, as a company that has represented shareholders and looked at a lot of the activities for public and private companies, what should companies like Ideanomics and others be sure to address related to this SEC proposal?
So the SEC proposal is really just the SEC doing its most fundamental function, which is making sure that there is trust between companies and their beneficial owners. I mean, shareholders own the companies, the boards report to us, and the fact that they would or could disclose information that might be misleading or inaccurate really undermines the whole idea of capitalism. So the fact that the SEC is saying you have to, when you disclose your material information, that it's verified, that it's part of the audit, really just makes absolute sense and is really welcomed by shareholders because ultimately material information means that it's financial information. It's information that investors use to make a buy or sell or a hold decision. And so if that information is not accurate, then you have no basis for comparability between companies. You know, we all rely on financial disclosures in the audit because it's a standardized format. It's trusted because we know if a company doesn't, that they're liable to litigation. And so if you start looking at every measure that is material in the same way, then you actually can have a decision-making framework. The other piece of it is that the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, SASB, has now merged with international organizations to create ISB, the International Sustainable Standards Board. So I'd say within the next few months, we're going to be having global standards of what is material. We believe that anything that is material should be verified, should be assured, and should be in the audit, that it's not just climate, that racial justice information, that basically anything that is considered to be material, and it's by a sector basis, should be verified. And so I think that this is a really good trend. I think this is part of the implementation of the new purpose of a corporation, that the Business Roundtable put out. It's an implementation of what the World Economic Forum calls the fourth industrial age. They put out a manifesto in January of 2020 saying that you take care of your employees, that you want to create a culture to attract the best and the brightest. You take care of your supply chain, your customers, and also your community. And that community extends to the whole planet, because if you're dumping in the commons, if you're dumping carbon in the commons, it's affecting everyone, including yourself. And so we think this is really just the emergence of a regenerative economy based on justice and sustainability, and that the old Milton Friedman-esque extractive economy is really in the process of winding down, that this is really an evolutionary movement.
Yeah. And I'm imagining, Andy, that the shareholders are definitely going to want data that is at least consistent in some form of fashion. And I think, Evan, that really falls squarely on what Proof of Impact is up to. I believe that you guys focus more heavily on the private sector, but what are some of the challenges in getting that data from your customers and making sure that it is consistent?
Yeah, great question. So there's sort of a data life cycle, right? That goes from, okay, what are our material metrics? How do we actually collect the data from the external world and bring it in? How do we validate and verify that data? How do we analyze that data in a meaningful way? So it's not just, hey, here's a disclosure, let me just put it out to the world, but what are we actually going to do with that data? And then how do we visualize it in a way that people can understand, and actually when you do go about reporting and disclosing it. So at each of those steps, there are, I won't say traps, but there's barriers, right? And different companies, different portfolio companies have different challenges because they're starting at different points. So what I will say, that's sort of the in-depth, but if you take a higher level perspective, I think there's probably three main challenges. One is the data lives in disparate locations. So you're talking about the E, the S, and the G that are in all different divisions and parts of the company. They don't necessarily have the same data structures. So you're going to have issues actually setting that data up in a metric format, right? So that's one issue. The other is the actual data collection. So you might say, hey, these are all of our material metrics. But then when you get down to it, you say, wait, we only have data on 30% of these metrics. So we then have to set up new workflows within the company, or actually collect the data that we need externally from stakeholders through surveys or IoT or whatever it might be. And then the third is the voluntary versus mandatory reporting issue. So this is where we've been operating in the past, has been voluntary reporting. And that's a big issue, actually, especially on the investor side, because they're like, hey, I want this data, I want to know what's going on, but the companies are sort of sovereign. I mean, they're not sort of, they are sovereign, right? And so they have to agree to this process. And part of the issue there is the companies then, without that sort of standardization, they're essentially sort of cherry picking metrics that might make themselves look good and avoiding the ones that might make themselves look bad. And so there's a lot of room there. This is why the SEC rule is so exciting, especially in the US. I mean, in Europe and other places, there's been more progress and more work to incentivize companies with the carrot or the stick, but the SEC rule definitely is a big push in the right direction.
Yeah. And I can see that data is not only going to impact really just the evaluation of ongoing businesses, whether they be public and private, and making sure that is on some level consistent. I mean, I imagine it'd be asking too much for it to all be perfectly consistent at this stage. But I mean, Aruna, there are new ESG companies every day that we hear about coming into the marketplace. And I know that you guys at Justly are obviously offering, broker dealers a little bit of a perspective on what these companies are doing. How do you assess these companies on the platform?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because, as we've all mentioned a few times, ESG, which is a term that not many people are familiar with, can mean so many different things.
Yeah.
For us, when you talk about the climate disclosures that the SEC is looking at, we love that because we already have companies on the platform that are renewable fuels or biodegradable plastics. So they're doing the right things. We also have companies on the platform that are owned by veterans, women, people of color, people with disabilities. Those are less obvious / measurable. So I think one of the things we've been doing is we've been working with Evan and the team at Proof of Impact just to try to standardize what our dashboard could look like and how we can make sure that companies pass, the ESG expectations that we have. It's neat because what Proof of Impact is doing is taking things like, as Andy mentioned, SDGs, SASB, different international standards. We get to decide justly which of those we're going to use in what ways. And then what's nice is we have these companies that are on the platform. At any given time, we'll have about 15 to 20 of them. But the other thing is, if for some reason we see an opportunity giving equal access to lots of folks, right, from $100 to $1 million, what happens is we will take those opportunities, put them on the platform, and donate 20% of our profits from that raise to a company like As You Sow. So that way we're trying to get the best of all the worlds for all the right reasons.
I love that. I love that idea. And certainly I can see that will continue to evolve. I mean, Alf, one of the things that seems to be coming back up time and time again in this discussion is this idea of standardization and reporting, whether you are a startup or whether you're a big company like Ideanomics, how you're going to report that information, especially to the SEC. But that requires a kind of a different way of doing business, as you alluded to at the start. How are you incorporating this into your kind of day-to-day activities?
Right now, it's challenging because we don't know exactly what the SEC framework will be. As you know, it's out for public input back to the SEC at this time. So we're starting to understand the areas that they're interested in, but really not the level of disclosure that's required. So in order to try and get a jump on this, so to speak, there are a number of leading software companies out there that provide frameworks for you to input and store and rate your ESG information. Ideanomics licenses that type of software. And we also have a dedicated ESG team. So I don't know if many public companies have invested in that type of resource yet, but we have people at the senior management level that are specifically focused on the ESG aspects of this so that we can start to build a picture of Ideanomics, because until we build that picture fully, we're not in a position to provide disclosure. So I have a pretty good feel for where we are, but obviously disclosure rules are very precise often. So first of all, having somewhere to, having the team focused on ESG and what it means to Ideanomics and its companies is the first thing. And the second thing is we now have a repository from a third party that's built a framework that we can hold and store all our ESG information in. And then as we understand the disclosure requirements, we can start to fit within that framework. But at this point, there are no standards. So we're trying to follow the path that hasn't yet been forged.
Yeah, no, I think, Alf, one of the things that you're highlighting there is really kind of having kind of an ESG expert or experts on the team, because it is an evolving space, and it really kind of made me think about kind of perhaps another challenge when we think about setting up regulatory practices for the space, which is how do you account for continued change? And Andy, I'm just curious, because this is something that obviously shareholders they're always adding new things, changing their perspective on things. How do you handle that, I guess, continued evolution in a world which seems to be requiring a bit more standardization?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one, that there are really very well-known standards. When we're working with every public company to get them to reduce their emissions 5% a year over the next 10 years. And what we're using is the CA 100 plus benchmarks. So the Climate Action 100 plus is $60+ trillion of assets. And that's a pretty good place to start with a benchmark. We've actually just put out recently a net zero report that uses that framework plus science-based targets, some CDP work. We're developing a set of metrics for linking executive compensation to emission reduction. And there's also a global net zero group that's being set up to actually create all these benchmarks to rate and rank every company in the world on these things. So I think that there's plenty of benchmarks to start with. It's not like we're starting from scratch. Those are the benchmarks that a huge portion of the market in terms of investors, all of the big pension funds, all the big asset managers have adopted and feel are pretty solid. So that'll be the place to start. A question I had for Evan just brought up that he said that companies are sovereign, and actually companies are owned by their shareholders and that they are required to have disclosure. Now, obviously private equity is a little bit different, but you look at, there's a lot of publicly traded private equity companies, Blackstone, KKR, Apollo, Carlyle Group, and we actually question whether or not they should be. We believe they should be actually disclosing certainly the climate impact of all of their portfolio companies. We actually think that that is a gap that the SEC should require because they're publicly traded. Now, I understand a private equity company or a company that's taken itself private so that they don't have to disclose, and there's a lot of risk there. But I don't know that a publicly traded company is sovereign in that way, and I think that the disclosure is actually required by law. So, but it is. I just was wondering about that.
Yeah, no, and so my comment was more focused on private companies, and it's the reason why I brought it up is because we notice and we're observing right now this sort of difference in approach among investors, mostly in terms of PE, who some are saying, hey, we're ready to take action and we're ready to start to be engaged in more active ownership, right? So an example is Schroders just came out with an engagement blueprint for more active ownership, and they have very specific examples of how an investor can take more action with their companies and be more engaged. And I think that's great. And then on the other side, which is the more traditional approach, is they're like, we don't really want to put too much pressure on the company. That's mostly more happening in the startup space, but even for companies that are larger, they're much more hesitant to sort of apply a little more pressure and be more engaged. And so that's the sort of divergence that I've noticed, that I'm hoping will start to move from the one traditional direction into the more active engagement process.
We're seeing companies actually emerge as leaders into this new evolving framework. I mean, an example would be we approached General Mills in, I think, 2017 about regenerative agriculture, and they ended up in 2019 adopting regenerative ag across their entire supply chain. And when asked about it at a webinar that we put on, the reason they gave is because they said, we need a resilient supply chain, that with these climate superstorms, industrial ag, all the soil gets washed away. Regenerative ag retains their soil, and so they can deliver the products. So, and because of that, a lot more money, a lot more investment went toward General Mills. And so all the rest of the market is now following that. We do a study, and General Mills was all alone in 2019. In 2021, 12 of the 17 big ag companies are all embracing regenerative ag, and it's purely self-serving because they need a resilient supply chain. And I could cite examples across almost every sector like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I guess it benefited them as well from a shareholder perspective. Now, Evan, I mean, just building on some of these points, you guys are handling a lot of challenges on the data front. And I know that kind of what's being alluded to, and from I'd say just a other categories perspective or other areas perspective is true about your space as well, which is consistency is key. I've done a ton of work in the machine learning space, and getting consistent data is pretty much the thing that decides whether your algorithm's going to function in a way that adds value or not. How are you guys tackling that data consistency challenge?
So this is actually an interesting discussion, and we put a lot of thought into it, right? Because on the one hand, right, I mean, just starting with metrics, right? We're talking a lot about metrics here and standard metrics like SASB metrics, industry. So you want that level of standardization so that investors and others can compare, right? One metric, apples to the other. But on the other hand, even within one of the 77 SASB industries, right, you're going to have companies that have completely different shareholders or stakeholders, right? So different customers, different employees, different board, whoever it might be. And they're going to have different preferences of what they think is important to them. So how proof of impact approaches it and where we're hoping more will go is that, you know, you want to use these leading frameworks as the standard to say this is where we should start to consider. But then we want to account for double materiality, which is not just the financial materiality and what's financially material, but also the stakeholder materiality. What do the stakeholders think is important to them? And so you have a starting set of metrics, but then you refine it through that double materiality process where you engage your stakeholders. Okay. And so that's what we think is really the best approach to ensure that the people who are most affected actually have a say into what the company measures and then focuses on improving.
Yeah. I mean, Aruna, you touched upon all of the areas that Justly's working on. And, you know, to Evan's point, I mean, trying to get that consistency can be challenging, and you got to find those root areas. But certainly you guys are focusing on green tech, minority ownership, corporate transparency, you know, a lot of different topics. How do you kind of maintain that flexibility while also trying to get that standardization?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I think there are two things we always think about. So one is transparency, right? So just the fact by, you know, let's go back to what the SEC is doing with, you know, climate disclosures around emissions, right? That's a great start. So now, you know, you have to admire all the companies. Ideanomics does an amazing job of this, of saying, we're going to get ahead of the curve. So that way, when someone comes and asks, we're already set for it. We're asking all of our companies to do the same thing. Along with transparency, though, inherently, as Evan has mentioned, as Andy, it's subjective, right? And if that's the case, a large part is how do we have independent analysis? And that's where companies like Proof of Impact make a world of difference, because they're third party, they're working directly with these companies that are on the platform. So we are making sure they're giving something independent. And by the way, that's a snapshot in time. And I think that's something that people also don't realize is happening. What's happening, you know, if you're talking about my, you know, how ESG am I today? Well, maybe I'm not ESG at all, but by being aware, by having some standards that I've established and showing my improvement, that is how we're actually going to make a difference. So regardless of the reasons, right, that's the path forward with the transparency and the independent analysis.
I really like that, Aruna. I mean, there's a lot of change that companies are making right now. And certainly I would say that we have many examples of companies that are trying to position themselves well in the ESG space. But I just be curious, and I'll kind of throw this question out to everyone, and maybe I start with you, Andy, on this, is how do you assess scale? How do you assess scale on these actions? You know, I mean, you talked about this, the regenerative ag, which is a significant change that this company is making, but you know, how do you make sure that something's not just being done for lip service versus really making changes?
So as you saw, last year we had 188 engagements with companies. We start with data. We start with research. We start with, for instance, after the George Floyd murder, we were saying, how do we even evaluate companies on racial justice? And there was no measure. So we brought together an expert team and we developed 57 key performance indicators on racial justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and started to gather the data. And now we are rating and ranking the Russell 1000. We maintain the data. We update it once a quarter. I agree that that things do change over time, and that the more we engage the companies, we've engaged probably 60, 70 companies now, and almost all of them said, oh, now we have a way to measure ourselves. Let's get on the path toward racial justice and DEI. They were all very, actually, of the 188 companies we engaged, 102 said, thank you for establishing some metrics, and here's where we are, and here's where we want to go. They set a trajectory. And from a shareholder standpoint, a company that can disclose honestly and also say, this is where we want to be in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. Well, now you've got something to monitor. Now you can say, did they make their milestones or not? And then if they didn't, what's the course correction they need to do? How did they learn? It's really an engagement, and it's a conversation. It is. And I think that that's what shareholders really want is honest disclosure, also an honest, a realistic, feasible trajectory toward goals with milestones along the way, and then regular reporting back. You know what, we didn't make our goal, but we're going to make a course correction, or we made our goal, or we exceeded our goal. That's what people want to invest in, because that is a good management team that's thinking, that's evaluating in real time, that's making course corrections. Those are the people you want to invest in, because you're investing in management teams. Ultimately, it's like, yeah, you need a good business model, but the ones who are going to succeed are the ones who are nimble and the ones who are creating culture that attracts the best talent. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
no, I think it
that's
does.
What we're seeing,
I think
across the board. It's really quite remarkable. 86 we had to escalate by filing resolutions, and then half of those said, okay, what should we do? And we withdrew the resolution when we reached an agreement. Only about 40 out of 188 went to a vote, and we had 8 majority votes and a 43% average vote. So shareholders are also voting much more now. That was remarkable. I mean, we had 8 majorities last year, 4 the year before. We had 2 the previous 27 years. So there's also an escalation in that.
Absolutely. I mean, Alf, you guys are a company at Ideanomics making a lot of the moves in this type of space. And as you just map out your plans, how does this effort scale in your mind?
It's a difficult one to understand what the future holds. I think, Andy hit the nail on the head. We have benchmarks right now. We don't have standards. I think we're taking an honest approach. We're looking hard in the mirror at our own company. We're trying to ask the hard questions. Other than those benchmarks, it's difficult to see, where the answers are. The piece that looks most challenging to us is the upstream evaluation of suppliers, particularly if you're in EV automotive, which we are heavily. We make everything from motorbikes to tractors to vans and charging systems. It's a global supply chain. Anybody that tells you that they source everything from the US has no idea how global supply chain works for automotive. So we're sourcing raw materials, parts for products from all over the world, Europe, Far East, South America. It's going to be difficult evaluating those partners if there are not the same benchmarks and standards in those countries. Right. And often, if it's a public company, it's somewhat easier, but many of the suppliers are family-owned businesses. They're level 1, level 2 suppliers to the big OEMs. It's difficult to understand their business without spending time with them. And I think that's what's really important. That's what we've done so far, is we've actually physically traveled, walked the facilities, spoke to them about ESG. Not all of them have all the answers right now, and some of them don't have good answers right now, right? But we need to know that they're on a path to put right anything that isn't within the acceptability of a public company like Ideanomics. But it's, like I said earlier, it's not something you can step into binary. Yeah, today we're ESG, yesterday we weren't. Hallelujah. Doesn't work that way. It's going to be progressive, because everybody has, if they're a public company, they have shareholders, they have suppliers, right? They have their own operations for disclosure, and they have the footprint of the products they put out as well. Even if they're software, they're running servers which have got cables and everything else in them. It's a very complex and fascinating area to look at. All I can say is we're taking it seriously. We're taking an honest approach to it. We're investing into making sure that we get it as right as much as one can, and the disclosure from the SEC will help us. It'll give us those guiding rails.
No, Alf, it's a great point that you mentioned, which is the global element here. Certainly, a lot of the big companies in this space are going to be trying to figure out how they incorporate perhaps more consistent global measures. But certainly the move by the SEC allows us to see the US market evolve and continue to push forward some of these key measures. It's been amazing to talk to all four of you, but before I let any of you go, here we are, Earth Day 2022. I'd love to get your kind of last thoughts on the space and what this year holds for us. Aruna, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. So I love actually what Alf said about the supply chain. What we're looking forward to doing in Justly is starting earlier on. We're partnering with a number of different organizations that have challenges and incubators. And the goal is to come provide the mentorship from an organizational design point of view, from doing the right thing point of view, from an environment point of view, from a leadership point of view, and growing that space with not only the commercialization of the idea, but the entire supply chain that goes with it. Because sometimes giving money to winners just isn't enough. If we're really going to make a difference, it has to be scalable. And so we're looking forward to doing a lot more of that this year.
Excellent. Evan.
I think the SEC proposed rule is a first step in the right direction. And I think that there will be more of that to come. And I think that there will be more than just annual report disclosures.
Yeah.
I think that there will be actually active performance management that is leveraged and made possible through technology, through direct integrations with data systems, and through evaluation approaches that look at both longitudinal performance and performance against benchmarks, because both of those are what's needed to see if a company is actually performing well.
Excellent. Andy?
I think we're at this amazing moment in time where we're seeing technology actually meet with policy and with people's awareness, where we're going to actually see some truly transformation of the way that business operates. I think that one of the things that Alfred was saying was about just this honest communication between shareholders and the companies. That's the core of it, because I agree, it's a global supply chain. You've got a lot of folks who are not reporting, not aware yet. It's about getting on the path and having an honest disclosure and an honest discussion, and about how, and Evan being able to report that and be able to actually crunch those data into something that is usable. So, and I guess, and Aruna, baking in good governance into startups is always key. It's so easy when you're creating a charter of a company to say, we're going to have gender equality, we're going to have racial justice. These things, when they're baked into the charter, it becomes part of the company. Imposing it later is so much more difficult. So right. I think all the things that we're all talking about here really lead to this idea of a regenerative economy based on justice and sustainability. And that's what the companies who are going to thrive and who investors are going to want to be part of.
Great. Alf, I'm going to give you the last word here. So, 2022 with Ideanomics, tell us what it looks like.
Yeah, I think, Andy's comments just now really wrapped up a lot of what I wanted to say. I think we're in a really, really interesting point in time. And to Andy's point, if you are already thinking about, we're a relatively, young company, we're in a growth market. So we're able to accommodate these changes probably better than some large storied companies with huge global operations, right? It's going to be more difficult for them to flex and bend in the way they'll need to meet the disclosure. It's going to be very interesting. We have a pay it forward mentality. We do like to share our findings with others because we do think this is a community effort. Like I said, I believe whether it's diversity in the workplace or it's environmental sustainability, these are societal changes, right? They're happening and they're required now, and it's a really interesting dynamic we see. And I'm available if anybody wants to reach out to hear about some of the pain as well as the pleasure we've had in exploring how to tackle this ESG thing.
Yeah, I think that the thing that I'm taking away from the conversation is that I'm heartened to see that we're not perceiving this as kind of that we're at the beginning of a path, but that we're on the path. We're actually making stuff happen. We're putting new foundations in place to push this into a more scalable model. And it's been incredible to hear the perspectives of all four of you on how that is happening. We've been speaking with Alf Poor, the CEO of Ideanomics, Andy Behar, the CEO of As You Sow, Evan Vahouny, the Chief Impact Officer of Proof of Impact, and Aruna Inalsingh, the marketing lead at Justly. It is Earth Day, and we've been talking a lot about, what this new SEC ruling has meant, or I'd say the new proposal that puts new rules in place for companies to require them to state things like their greenhouse gas emissions, as well as several of the other details of how they're approaching climate change. And what we're seeing today, really, in this conversation is that it's going to impact pretty much every area of business, whether it be operations, the way companies are reporting it publicly, if they're publicly listed, the way that they're listing privately, the way that companies, that if they're trying to get off the ground and raise some more capital, how they'll approach that marketplace. I thank all four of you for being with us today to talk about this topic. Happy Earth Day, everyone, and let's continue to build this ESG world.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thanks all of you.